Welcome back, everyone, for this session on higher music education institutions as driving forces in society. And it has been prepared by Lies Koolman and Suzanne van Els, who are both also working in higher music education. Basically, my role as a moderator in this session will be extremely limited because Lies and Suzanne will do the presentations, but also the moderation. So from here, I just hand over to Lies, and I'm listening.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lies Koolman, and my colleague indeed is Suzanne van Els. We're both classically trained musicians. Suzanne is a viola player, while I'm a pianist, and we both also have developed a career in higher music education. We're affiliated to institutions and are also active on a European level via AEC, for example, the Association Européenne des Conservatoires. We are peer reviewers internationally, and we're both members of working groups in teaching and learning, capacity building, societal engagement, and so on. Well, I'm going to share my presentation. So first, I'm going to see if I can kick anything up. Voila. This now should be the presenter mode. Voila. In the time that we have at our disposal, we would like to do two things. In the first half, we will have a presentation on the topic that we will address. And it will be followed by an active discussion, a conversation with all of you here present. But first, of course, we would like to get an idea of exactly who you are and who is present. So we have a little question for you to answer. And here it is. If you can take your smartphone or open your browser and go to the website you see at the left, Slido or slido.com, you will be asked to fill in the code 124758. And then you see a list of different sectors we have just listed, and we're curious to see where you're active in. You can add more than one sector. As soon as you press enter, we should see the results here. I hope it works. Yes, it works. Just see. Okay. Oh, it was a little bit too quick, I think. Yes, a lot of research, a lot of higher music education. Everybody's active. That's a good thing to know. Well, thanks for the nice diversity, and I will hope this sparks some lively conversation later on. The topic that we want to address, you already know, is the role of higher music education as a leading force in society. What role could we as institutions play in a changing world, and what is the connection with professional fields as our necessary partners with the common goal? Well, both within the performing careers that we have, as in our educational activities, Suzanne and I have, of course, witnessed and experienced firsthand that for the last decades, the field has significantly changed. There are fewer orchestra positions, there's an increasing internationalization, there's an unlocking of new and non-traditional genres, styles, and presentation formats. There is the necessity for economical self-directedness, and so on. And at the same time, society changes, of course, in different areas such as diversity and inclusion, social engagement, sustainability, and so on. Both the professional industry of classical music performance and society, which we might look upon as the provider of our students and the audience, or better, the community that we position ourselves in, they are inseparable from higher education. And the way that institutions have responded lately in preparing the future professionals for these new tasks and circumstances are in a direct consequence of changes in these fields. We feel But higher music education holds a pivotal role, not just between the past and the future, but also between education and the professional field. And just as the musical profession is inseparable from economic, cultural, and social societal evolutions, so of course is the educational sector. So before we continue, I do want to do a quick poll again, because it all went so well last time. We all have expectations from professionals, whether we are in the educational sector or in the professional performance sector. So my question here is, what exactly do you think are the roles of higher education? I listed some of the most recurring answers here, so you can click them in order of importance that you think yourself. So not just click one, but make a list in which one is the most important role or assignment. 8 could be the least important. There they come. Just gonna scroll down a little bit down for the research. We don't want to miss the research. So terrific. Support creativity, improvisation, interdisciplinarity. Ah, okay, it changes. You can still add some answers if you want. But already we see that we do have a lot of expectations for higher music education. So, one more. We can come back to this slide later to see if anything has changed. So as long as the poll is open, you can add your own answers here. But thank you, that's quite interesting. I think we can keep these answers in mind when we start asking you the questions in the conversation later on. Well, in this presentation, first, we want to illuminate briefly, although it's not that briefly, I have to admit, the status questiones and how the pivotal role of higher music education has evolved. Firstly, we want to address its traditional operation established from a historical perspective. Subsequently, the changes and evolutions connected to a cultural, economic, and social environment. We actually want to show some of the concrete and profound changes that have happened already in curricula and in the graduate attributes and in the quality standards, and how the institutions already go to great efforts in order to prepare their students to fit the changed industry standards. Subsequently, we want to address the next pressing challenge, being the proactive role and the responsibility of our institutions for the professional field, and vice versa. This challenge does not only sprout from economic or societal changes, but also from an artistic, substantive perspective, addressing the presentation and position of classical music as a healthy and experiential, horizontally qualitative, and broadly active sector. And most importantly for this presentation now and in this challenge is the relationship between the education sector and the professional fields, to create a fruitful flow of musicians and of practices, of experiments and ideas on the whole musical performance culture. We would like them to seize the opportunity to address the issues before us from different professional perspectives and investigate mutual beneficial connections and goals, and also what we as an educational sector need from the musical sector to fulfill our assignments. Since the way that conservatoires operate nowadays is undeniably rooted in history, it is helpful to take a quick glance at the historical disposition. So it's not the intention here to give a music history lesson, of course, and the evolutions that I described are far more complex and intertwined and far less linear than I described. But a quick oversight will clarify some of the current accents and traditions that we have, as well as the manner in which higher music education institutions have connected themselves to society, to the musical content, and to the professional industry. When we take a look at the emergence of the education sector, we see that this is mainly a movement that took place mid-19th century. And by that time, the experience of high classical music was centered around the concert hall. Whereas formerly composed music was mainly to be found in religious context or by the grace and investment of aristocracy, both of them had dramatically lost influence by the end of the 18th century, and a new romantic ideal had taken over. Music was, so to say, freed from her religious function and awarded a certain independent status. The role of the bourgeoisie, for example, became more important, and music was brought into new contexts with new expectation from, as well as for the audience, but perhaps more influential for us, from as well as for musicians. So a whole new culture came into being, almost making sacred certain composers and repertoire. And the perfect rendition of a composition was the ultimate goal. It was very clear for an audience, for performers, and for composers what the expectations were. Education was founded upon these expectations, and logically it aimed for an increasing quality, but it did not really feel the need for changing these expectations as such. Lifelong learning has always been a part of higher education, but this was mainly limited to prepare the future professionals to be able to overcome technical difficulties by themselves and to master new repertoire, so actually to continue and to enhance without breaking out of the expectations. And until very deep within the 20th century, the ideal was the perfect performance of music. And the professional performance field embraced this continuously in its operation, inadvertently and the way fixing its formats for generations to come up until today. And that this ideal was a predominant opinion even until the 21st century can clearly be concluded from the curricula and the programs that we still have. When we look here at the Polyphonia Dublin descriptors, these are the learning outcomes as agreed by the European Conventions of Conservatoires in light of the Bologna Agreement. We can see striking similarities with this century-old paradigm. I'm not going to read all of them. You can already form an idea based on the categories. If you want to learn more, at the bottom I've written the link where you can find them all. But when we take into account that these learning outcomes are the basis around which all educational activities are organized, curricula, pedagogy, quality enhancement, benchmarking, it is no surprise that these only confirm the conventional convictions of the requirements of the musical profession on the one hand, and on the purpose of education as the enabler of quality and stability on the other. Music, enhanced music education, had a rather stable and uncontested societal function and position. Supply and demand, so to call, were in balance, and audience and musicians shared the same expectations. Higher music education focused on the content, which is mainly the performing of the canon, which was within the expectation of the music industry. There was no demand actually for real experiments, not a real demand for change, which at the same time is of course a limitation of the core of music. And aesthetics became disconnected from the ethics, from the core of music. Well, due to large economic changes over the last decades in particular, just think of the necessary mergers of orchestras, of cuts in structural government fundings, and of overall economization, musicians and organizations were faced with new realities. The rather naturally assumed relevance of music, which was far less a point of discussion in times of economic stability, pose now real difficulties in terms of sustainability and of survival, not just of individuals, but almost of a sector as a whole. The quantitative financial argument overshadowed the qualitative. Why should so much money go into a niche which still had a rather elitist reputation when other economic sectors are also struggling, but also when at the same time other musical genres received far less support? Just think of pop and rock. And they seem to be able to find a sustainable way of survival. In the question for relevance, however, also lies deceptive dichotomy, which was far too often interchanged. Because what was actually being under discussion here? Was it the relevance of classical music? Or was it the relevance and the sustainability of the traditional regulation and of the performance presentations in the sector? It became, however, clear that a model of a single director focused career was no longer an option for many young graduates. Not only had the number of positions themselves drastically fallen, the competition had become exponentially larger thanks to internationalization, thanks to Bologna and the equalization of educational and industry-led standards, thanks to Erasmus. The number of identical profiles had made competition almost impossible. Even each orchestra audition, even now, let's say for a clarinetist, attracts about 200 candidates, all playing the same repertoire in the same styles with comparable talent and expertise. So the professional reality had changed, so did the industry demands. Those who did not obtain a full-time position were on their own. The portfolio career, as we call it, became the standard, demanding entrepreneurship, financial, management requirements. So it was logical that education also needed to take these requirements into account. And new courses emerged, new skills were trained. However, this did actually not impact the artistic training or the perception on what it actually is to be a classical musician. At least all the extra courses took as little as possible focus and time away from what really counted: artistic, technical proficiency. We can look again at the learning outcomes, which had changed. This category of competences had found its way into the bachelor and mainly into the master programs Europe-wide. This is the 2017 AEC learning outcomes list. We have artistic, theoretical, generic attributes that were updated, meeting the changing industry standards. And there we see, I'm not going to read them all, you can read them by yourself, the introduction of new focuses, such as management, entrepreneurship, and so on. But, as I said, we cannot really claim that the artistic context had changed. Quite the contrary, the traditional values, the system, the presentation formats were not addressed as such, but rather sustained by finding external ways to sustain the tradition as much as possible as it was established back in the 19th century. To give an example, even when new focuses and new programs were enabled in higher music education, these did not change the face of the format, quite the opposite. For example, when we had jazz and world music introduced in higher music education, they found a place. But instead of developing a new educational practice, the same existing format was opposed upon these focuses as well, driving them more or less away from what their core was into the structure that already existed. To continue with our overview, the economic evolutions did not stand isolated. Strongly connected to the question of entrepreneurship, how do I build a self-sustained career? Emerged the question of the audience. And connected to the audience emerged the question, what does the audience want? Who is our possible audience? It is undeniably clear that music cannot exist outside of a cultural reality and needs the social perspective. Music does not need to be confined to the concert hall. Quite the contrary, music should reach out to its audience, find a way for the audience to actually participate in the experience to what degree that participation might be. This movement towards outreach, towards societal engagement also had an effect on the learning outcomes, as we again see here a few examples. If you want to have a more overview, again, at the bottom, I have added the link. But also here, again, notwithstanding all initiatives, all movements and projects and research, we still have to see that in reality, traditional format is not abandoned yet, hardly even changed by this new redirection. Indeed, there are multiple new possibilities and experiments, and they're perfectly in line with the idea of the portfolio careers. But in fact, there is a vertical value system in place, which is rooted in the tradition and is actually particularly sustained within our sectors. Probably the most difficult threat, if you could call it that, is the perception by ourselves, by the teachers, by the programmers, by the musicians, that anything outside of the traditional format is intrinsically, artistically, qualitatively less valuable. It has the connotation that there are lower standards in artistry. We hold on to the elitist idea that true art can only be appreciated in the right context, by the right audience. Anything else is nice, but less. I just quickly want to refer here to the examples that Stefan Rosso has given us during the first roundtable this morning, which he concluded with the reaction of a colleague, that the quality of these changes, of these new realities, simply is not the same. Oh, I think too enthusiastic. This is, of course, a thorough reduction of the value and of the relevance and the meaning, the core of music itself. The value cannot be reduced to a setting or a format or a score even. It has a plethora of possibilities that are not explored or that are denied just because of the reduction to the traditional format. And we keep adding skills and attitudes, and we keep designing projects and experiments, but at the same time, there's still the confinement of the narrow strains of the distant past, and it's really necessary to start rethinking and exploring outside of the box instead of bringing new initiatives into the existing box. So we're actually advocating a shift in paradigm. And this brings us to the next stage and the next challenges we are facing right now, and that's not just for music education. We need to return more to the core of music instead of focusing on the score. We need to find ways to repair the connection between the aesthetic and the ethical side of music. We need to release ourselves of the confinement of the purely traditional structures and to bridge the gap of the apparent dichotomy as if we need to choose between quality, artistic quality, and social relevance instead of embracing them horizontally. And we can rethink the audience in terms of community to which we actually belong. And we can try to create mutual immersion and experience. Actually, the higher music education sector has made important steps towards exploration of possibilities over the last few years. And a major contribution to this paradigm shift has been investigated and enabled by the SMS project, Strengthening Music and Society. It was a Creative Europe project initiated by the AUC, exploring from different perspectives the opportunities, threats, and the strengths of our education system. Here you see a few possible outcomes if you want to explore further, especially in its final paper, which was supported by the YouTube message. The SMS working group advocates for a different approach to pull music out of its walls, not just in order to make it economically sustainable or to fit traditional operation into a societal context, but to always, in which circumstances that might be, connect the individual musician to community instead of just an audience. Make music making an immersive experience for the musician as well as for the participating community, where quality is not measured by a vertical evaluation system, where the traditional concert hall is still the top of the pyramid. And although valuable steps have been made towards a new view on the music profession, and a lot of initiatives are and have been explored, of which we have heard some examples this morning, there's still some major necessary changes ahead of us, and changes that will not affect the quality or the core of our profession, but rather will change the way we perceive and organize our sectors to open up a fruitful and stimulating environment for music, for musicians, and for the community. It might be said that as a classic music sector, we are running a little bit behind. But it also may be said that we can look outwards and let ourselves be inspired by good practices and examples from other performing arts. Over the last decades, for example, theater has had the same questions, but it has emancipated itself more and more from the historical shackles, not discarding the historic values, the canon, the repertoire, and so on, but making efforts to reposition it, reconnect it, immerse it in a community. And a fine example, one of many, could be Tutti Fratelli, which is an Antwerp-based theater workshop led by the recently deceased Grand actrice Renilde de Clercq, but working with people in socially, economically, psychologically vulnerable circumstances, still in very professional settings, with very high quality levels of support and of results. And somehow within the sector, this is an initiative that enjoys no different quality scaling than, for example, de Clercq's traditional theater or movie work. Another inspiration we can get, for example, from contemporary dance. Lies Leerman is an advocate for hiking the horizontal, so making no qualitative differences between the different professional possible settings, always demanding full talent, always demanding full commitment and results. Quality lies not just in the perfect technical performance, it lies not in circumstances, or if you translate it to music, the perfect musical performance is not the same as the perfect performance of the music score. And that brings me back to the beginning of this overview. The reason, the circumstances in which certain performance formats and habits came into being no longer exists. And the fact that the performer is but an executor and is outdated. The fact that the only thing an audience can do is to sit back and digest what is presented is massively reductive of what music is and what music can do. The next step in this process, I believe, and I'm not alone here, lies within the art of classical music, in the art of dealing with and showing, performing, sharing, creating and recreating classical music. We have to let go of the idea that the highest quality only comes in a very few forms, and that some things must always be preserved, untouched by our own creative powers. And there lies the challenge to make this circle fully round. That is me, by the way. Just as modern dance has left the classical style for a new style in sense of expression without giving up on technique and history. And just as theater has given a place to tradition and history in new formats and rethought repertoire, we as the classic music sectors have the opportunity to rethink our course, be creative with the material and the practices and the presentation formats, participatory possibilities as less restrictive and reductive as possible. Perhaps not even complementary, but as another all-encompassing perspective, a new paradigm on classical music performance and on presentation practices. And this does not mean that we have to throw away everything we have, but rather to open up for a multitude of alternatives that are equally valuable and, more important perhaps, equally valuated by our own sectors. And that is something that will need support from all of us, from all perspectives. Education will always react to professional needs, and the sector will always have to work with the graduates from education. But in order to move forward, we have to share the ambitions and be open to tackle some difficult, necessary hurdles. And yeah, it might sound quite abstract, but for us here at the conference, this is not a new idea, quite the contrary. I think of what Hannah testified earlier today about her less traditional creation processes with non-professionals in the streets of London. But for many of our stakeholders, actually within our own sectors, they're not yet ready to explore these possibilities, mainly because of the long tradition and of the fear that we might lose the values. Still, we need to address the difficult questions. What are our next challenges and what are our goals And what concrete solutions and good practices could we come up with to support and stimulate this paradigm shift? And again, I just invite you now to write a few words. You can come up with what is the main challenge for opening up our professional sectors to make it a more horizontally evaluated sector. You can write again in the poll. You can answer multiple suggestions, and they will come here. I will leave it open for a bit. And while we are receiving some of your answers, perhaps I think I have spoken long enough. So to kick off the interactive part, I'm now giving the stage to Susanna, actually, and I have a very concrete question to start with. Susanna, we all have high ambitions with our students. We want them to be technically proficient, artistically skilled. We want to be critical and innovative, reflexive, and socially engaged. Just think of the questions that were asked earlier during the presentation. But actually, when we look at our applicants, literally 90% comes to the conservatoire with only one goal in mind, which is to be a classical performer and to be an orchestra musician, soloist, perhaps sometimes a teacher. And perhaps more striking is that the majority of our teachers share these ambitions for their students, as well do the jury members, for example. So what do you think that is? After all that has happened during the last decades, why do you think that is still the case? And what causes this rigidity, and why would we need to change this?
Well, thank you, Lies. Lot of interesting text from your side, very defined presentation, and a nicely provocative question, while I'm actually at the same time looking at the answers. Well, we can get back to the answers and start the roundtable. So it's very interesting what you mentioned. So first, in your presentation, I think it's quite clear that the industry in our profession is not leading anymore when it comes to providing jobs. However, it's still very much supplying leading images. And indeed, for instance, our classical music students still think that they could or should become soloists or orchestral members. And in our education, we actually also support this story. Just look at the repertoire in exams and look at what we assess our students on. We test, compare, and grade them on solo performance repertoire, conventional repertoire, standard repertoire. It's very interesting. So it's the situation that we have is not one of a developing industry and education then following this. It's really the other way around. But when you look at the entrance moment in our education, it's actually also quite different from other sectors. I think that students in other sectors, for instance, within the arts, in theatre, but also in commercial and technical education, are usually inventive. IT students have their own startups, and theatre students are very much engaged in actual topics and discussions like Black Lives Matter and gender issues. Music students, on the other hand, have had already a large part of their 10,000 hours training when they enter a conservatoire. So they already soaked in all the classical images of what a musician, a conductor, an opera singer looks like and behaves like. And also, they're already long time a passive member of ideas that emanate from the way their training was organized. Early specialization, early selection, constant competition, constant comparison. So we can't expect our students to be driving forces of change at the same time. So that strongly supports my idea that conservatoires are laboratories for our profession and for our art. And I think SMS was really a good project to support this and see that education tried at least to take up the initiative and define what we should look like. Maybe at least you can show this manifesto that I wrote actually already a couple of years ago, and I'll share a link for people who are interested to read more on this. I wrote this together with Camilla Overgaard already a couple of years ago. The world of music, and specifically classical music, has a strong tendency for heroism and hierarchy. Leading images in classical music are not just looking very much alike, they also support narrow and limiting ideas about how success is achieved. There is a need for all the other narratives to be told and displayed. There's a need for young musicians to be empowered when following their dreams. What I see a lot is that they're sort of not in contact with their dreams anymore because of the training that they had preliminary to entering conservatoires. And it's a really difficult task to then liberate the students again and make them be in contact with their initial dreams. And I think the answer to your question, Lise, is also in this text. We should start with creating space for other images. For instance, not just display prize-winning students on the conservatoire website, but select other memorable acts and start to discuss in our conservatoires, redefine what success is in our profession nowadays, what it looks like, and align programs and include assessment, of course, because if we don't include assessment, no changes will happen. I also brought another image, which we could just look at. It might be helpful in such a process. I really think that when we define the role of a musician, the urgency of what we musicians do, what we present to society, what our function is, we can't remain in the inner circle of the instrumental. In the end, I believe, and I think you believe, Lise, being a musician is about humanity and about relating to people and community as a human with music. So I think really conservatoires can empower their students in rediscovering their creative drive, inviting them to define what they want to develop and what they want to become, and supporting them in a musicianship with a strong relation to why we need music in society. Otherwise, conservatoires only conform themselves to training instrumentalists. And, well, that's a lack of diversity, which is in nature always a recipe for the end of something.
I just found the mute button. I have to find the unmute button again. So after this it was actually too long, the presentation. When I practiced it, it was quicker. Well, anyhow, we would really like to open up the discussion now, and especially when I saw your reactions with the last poll. There's a plethora of ideas, and so I just suggest if anyone has something out of the blue to add, please raise your question so we can start off. I just opened the chat as well. No questions there. So I'll close the chat. It will be more easy if we just work with raised hands. Oh no, I don't want to leave the meeting. I just want to close the chat. So perhaps to repeat the question, where do you think, from all of your perspectives, could be possibilities to open up sectors, to find ways to connect education with professional demands? How can we change the professional view upon what is needed from our students? As you said, we need to open up their interest. They need to be a mediator. We have to leave the historical ideological ideas, for example. So, who wants to kick off? Perhaps Denise, I hope you're here. I heard you earlier on. I hope you will be joining us in this session. I heard earlier today that you had some ideas. So perhaps can I give the word to you? Putting you on the spot, that's what I like.
No, that's totally fine. No problem at all. Yeah, thank you for this fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. Also because I'm an amateur cellist. I started playing just recently when I started the PhD, and I also did research at the conservatory in Maastricht for I think the time period of a year where I was visiting cello classes of 3 teachers and had conversations with them, and also, of course, with the students. And what I noticed is that, indeed, what you say, this creative, there's a lot of creative drive sort of coming from the students. And what you could really see, and that's maybe something that some people can share. I'm not even sure if we have students from the conservatory here today. It would be also nice to hear, to hear them, of course, in this discussion. But what is really interesting is that they often felt like the education that they were receiving is limited in that respect. For example, in sort of experiencing and trying different sorts of repertoires. But then again, as I think you said, Susanna, right, the students cannot be the drivers of this change, because they're of course being educated, and the negative consequences that fall back on the students in sort of professional development, they cannot change that themselves. The system, we have to change the system for them to enable this change, for them to explore more and to be, to also discover and explore themselves more. And there was, it was just so interesting because there was so much drive for that, which I found really remarkable. And then, of course, it really depends on what happens in these sessions. And then you have these, educational systems, of course, with the one-on-one classes. And it's really hard to open that up, because on the one hand, it's of course very important to have these individual lessons. On the other hand, there's also, that gives room to sort of continue a tradition in also very established ways. So it's a hard thing to balance. But Susanna, I see you waving your hand.
Yeah, I was thinking, because you mentioned this, of the students and their role and their position. And it's deeper than this. It's already very deep in their perception of how learning and teaching should be organized. I sometimes tell the anecdote, and most of the people recognize it. So for instance, I'm in the committee at an entrance exam for a pianist, classical pianist, bachelor. And I can see in their heads, once we tell them, okay, you're in, we accept you as a Bachelor 1 student in our conservatoire, welcome. And you can see them think, okay, this is the moment to stop creating songs, to stop with my band, to quit, the strange duo I had with this, schoolmate or whatever, because now I'm going to be a classical pianist. And I want to grab them and yell at them and say, no, please continue with all this, the funny stuff, the weird stuff, the looking for other stuff, etc., etc. So it's very deep in sort of, it's not just the images, but there's also many stories. I've just written, maybe it's interesting to you, I've written quite a fundamental advice for a big young talent program with several arts. And it's incredible when you really dive into the research, how much of the research we just leave at the corner of our table. And it's as interesting as the 10,000 hours, which we do buy. The multi-instrumentalism, for instance, came out of important research. We just put it aside because it doesn't fit the images. So we're quite stuck. That's what I'm saying. We're quite stuck, all of us, in lots of images and ideas, which will keep supporting themselves, actually.
Yeah, maybe just before I give the floor to Joanna, maybe just to add to that, to quickly respond, what I find really interesting, and is that I saw that too, is that everything that students do in a sort of more explorative way or interdisciplinary ways, they do on the side in their free time, and there's no way for them to bring that into the conservatory. It becomes this sort of side activity. And we talked about that before, right? About this compartmentalization. And there we see again that it's not much different from orchestra practice, in the sense that we have to start deconstructing these compartments for them, for that activity to actually become part of music education.
Thank you. Indeed, let's give the floor to Joanna. And I see your hand raised as well, Anna. So after Joanna, perhaps you can take the word.
Hi there. Hello, everybody. It's been really great watching these sessions. So I'm a pianist, and I'm just here in my capacity actually as head of piano at the Royal Academy of Music, where we've been tussling with everything we're talking about. And I completely agree. I think you have to, in fact, change the curriculum because otherwise everything is too marginal all the time. The changes are just tweaks. They're not proper changes. So just very briefly, with my piano students who all come in, as you describe, at this very high but quite conventional level, I've immediately tried to change their curriculum so they're not just examined on Mozart piano concertos and Beethoven sonatas and all the things we want them to play brilliantly, but we run classes in curating and multimedia, film improvisation, collaborating with other musicians from different genres. And I run a couple of big festivals where they will actually display all this in public. They're not examined on it per se, but what I have noticed is that their choice of repertoire has changed beyond recognition. I mean, so much so that in a final concerto exam for undergraduates, one of my students who's Iranian wrote his own piano concerto rather than playing Rack 3 or something like that. And I said, yeah, just write your own piano concerto. We'll examine you on that. And I think maybe these are, you know, we have to give them the space within the conservatoire and they'll fill it, you know, because I think what's very impressive about young musicians is how incredibly creative they are. And it's up to us to unlock that. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Susanna, would you want to react to that directly, or?
Yeah, just very quickly, and then of course Anna has the floor. It's very important. I love this, Joanna. Thank you very much. And I think it's very important that we understand that we as professors, as leadership in conservatoires have a very important task there. And that is really to talk about quality. So that is the layer behind, you know, the repertoire, the canon, the traditions, etc. But to really have a discussion with students about the quality of what they come up with, this new piano concerto, the new forms that they want to put on the stage. And so I think there's a bigger task there, and people sometimes fear that they are losing, you know, the floor or ground for their expertise and experience. But I think it's actually on a much more interesting level that we have a very strong task. Sorry, Anna.
Thank you for the presentation and so interesting points. I was just thinking that I'm currently now working on an article about like networking in the classical music culture. And what comes up there is that, well, firstly, the networks are very unequal and heavily gendered. So women have difficulties accessing the same kind of networks as men has, not even to talk about racial inequalities. But also when women don't maybe reach these kind of networks that would gain them some kind of the same kind of access to men's network, and they start doing something else than let's say the repertoire that is the canonized one. Repertoire that is outside of it is considered kind of like other than classical music, so it becomes like a genre discussion as well. Like it's a sub-genre of the classical music repertoire, which is, I think, also it brings up again to the discussion of like what is classical music, and it's such a broader discussion of again genres and aesthetics and what is the quality that is actually in these kind of discussions. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think you have a really interesting point, and not just about the inequality. I think that's a point that Guru wants to answer to, but the discussion, what is classical music? We keep asking the question, but sometimes we just have to start doing, I think, and showing what is all possible, and not keep repeating the same questions, but just do. Guru, I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect pronunciation. Thank you. And yeah, I'm a pianist. I studied actually in Cologne and still live here. And I'm a freelancer. I don't teach. So, but it was very interesting. Thanks a lot for your presentations and for also the questions. They bring a lot of opinions in my mind also, and remind me of my own education. I always think this, it's so difficult to you know, there is such little time, you know, just let's say 4 years in this higher music education, because actually this perception of, I think, music and how to deal with it and what to create starts really when we are children, and when we actually start with music, when we don't know anything about Bach and Beethoven and Mozart yet, where we can really improvise and be more free. Because the time when we enter the conservatory, I was 21. I was already so full of too much information, and as you say, it's a lot of let's say friendly rivalry maybe, and all this competition, all this mindset. And on the other hand, we also want to be creative, but we actually don't have time. And also, it's, you know, we also want these orchestras to have also this musical quality, and for that one needs great instrumentalists also. So I think it's like a two-faced, yeah, it's so I think people, I mean, at least students, start being creative and actually start thinking about what they want after they graduate. At least this is what happened to me. Like when we get into this professional life, there it starts, where we start to see where our possibilities are, where our limitations are. So if one can become a soloist, or let's say orchestra musician, or maybe one realizes actually one wants to actually do research and do another type of contribution. And there is an immense amount of judgment, I think, because also, I don't know, I realize when I come up with different ideas and try to change something and talk about this with really professional, really worldwide range musicians, they look at me like, oh, she doesn't have enough concerts, so she started thinking about, I don't know what, you know. And so I think, yeah, it's full of a lot of fear against change, and yeah, I talked a lot, but I don't have a solution really. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, but you're completely right. Often we hear it also in our education systems, when we offer possibilities and creative projects and interdisciplinary project and research, that students answer, okay, I'll do it, but I'm never going to use it in my professional career, because a lot of them still aim, even after 5 years, for that orchestra position or for a solo performance career. And when reality hits and they don't get a position, they have to go to other sides. And that's a wrong idea. They feel like it's a degradation, while we see it as a whole. Why would you want to diversify or just aim for one thing, and anything else should be less? It's not because you do something different that the artistic quality should be different as well. So there's something in our mindset that still has to change. Asya, do you want to take the word?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to take the word and also respond a bit to Guru. Once again, I'm sorry if I pronounced it completely wrong and messed it up. But your message resonated in me, because I can imagine what it means when you are trying some things and it goes out of conventional model of what a musician can do. So I think the basic idea that, of course, will change the direction of development within the conservatory is the mindset of a musician about his role in society. And that's why now I'd like to give two inputs, a kind of that I came up with and that I'm really interested in. I will be really happy if somebody would like to take it, to continue with this, or maybe even to collaborate with me, because it's really a kind of point of my interest. So the first thing is that we as musicians, and I'm a music theory student, so I'm not playing an instrument professionally on a high level, but I like sharing knowledge about music. I think the first thing that we can do for the society is, of course, to entertain in a very good sense, to intellectually entertain people and to make this entertainment more joyful and more convenient. Because, of course, a lot of, some people don't know how can they enjoy classics. And that's the way it goes. So we can create some environment, not just a concert, but around the concert that, of course, was already discussed during this day, that can help people to really get excited by it, to really get energy from it, to really enjoy it. That's something that we can do. And of course, some processes are already going there, and we all try to, to encourage the audience, to involve more audience and stuff. So we should definitely continue with this. And this is something at least familiar. And this is something that maybe you tried this, maybe you tried to give some webinar, or you tried to talk with an audience. This is something that you will not be refused about. And it is still already, there is already a trial about it. And I think we should definitely continue with it, to ease the audience, to help it to get the pleasure of classics. But the second field, the second sector, up to my idea, is completely unraveled, is completely dismissed. Maybe I'm wrong, please correct me. And it goes about the idea that the music can not only entertain us, but it can also develop us. It can, there are theories that it can heal, but let's leave it for now. I mean that there is actually an increasingly growing interest, as far as I know, in terms of the research, how the music can develop our thinking, our skills, our brain, and there are already, very strong confirmations that it does change our brain, and I also was curious about it. So, it means that it can be applied to the health industry, so to say, on different levels, starting from old people, and there are very specific, very concrete results on how it can influence, for example, some drumming practices together with people who have dementia and other kind of stuff, to children to develop their thinking skills, their analytical skills. Why? Because classical music is such a unique matter that has a lot of information inside, and when we try to listen to it, try to get in touch, then we develop ourselves. So I'm sorry to talk very long. So I mean, this role is also very important, and it's not used at all. Musicians can do it, they can help it. So, and this changes the role of classical music, so it becomes more useful to the society enormously, because it can, help us to be more successful also. It points to a very different aspect, I think, of our life. And this is the direction that I think definitely should be explored more. Thank you very much. Sorry for a long talk.
Oh, thank you, Asya. Well, I have to think now just of something that Susanna, I think the day before yesterday, told me that when you have a musical performance, everybody changes. Not just the audience, but you as a musician, you also change. You have the same experience, and it's different than before. You have shared something that has changed you somehow. Well, I think we're almost, Peter, I'm looking at you now. You're almost at the end of our, so perhaps open the question, the floor. If someone still has to something to say or something to ask, I think now is the time. One more burning question, one more burning opinion.
Now is the time. Okay, I don't see any raised hands, and I conclude that, well, we have a lot of food for thought. I want to thank Lies and Susanne for initiating this roundtable. Really urgent topics have been discussed, so thanks a lot for that. And also thank you for participating in this session. And after half an hour of break, I hope to see you back in one of the two parallel sessions remaining on the program for today.